mentioned last night about the factor that you had to use to adjust to the drawings. 19.6.
Well,
19.625.
yeah, the horse gave me the plan of the L-30 that he had in a reference book on the German Zeppelins during World War I. And it was a fairly large diagram. It was about 10 inches long. And I made a Xerox copy of that and enlarged it a bit on my copier. And then that enlarged version I measured, and I needed to create a conversion factor. So I would measure the plan in millimeters and then multiply that, actually in centimeters, and multiply that by 19.625, I figured out was the conversion factor, which converted it into quarter-inch scale. And that's what we used. And I sent it out to Sandy, and he did the drawings of the circumference of the bag, and then he sent that to me, and I drew the areas where the gondolas were going to fit into the bag and sent it back to Sandy, and we made our parts respectively, and they came out here, and by golly, they fit. They just like a glove. The other thing, I decided, since we were going to have these gondolas, we ought to put an interior in them. And I wanted lighting, so I put a LED, light-emitting diode lighting, in all the gondolas. Are they on today?
Yes, they're on.
Okay. So you can look inside and see what the gondolas look like. And here again, Horst Schirmer provided me with the appropriate information. There was not, and there were some photographs in black and white, but there was a book in which there were color diagrams, paintings of the inside of the gondola of a German World War I Zeppelin, and that was great because it showed me just what we should do. And for instance, in the control gondola, which is the forward one, there's a chart table, and on the chart table there's a map of England and centering on London. And of course the control wheels are there, and the various valves and so forth in it, and then the 6 Maybach engines. And the most difficult part of putting that Zeppelin together were these outriggers where the propellers are hung out on the side of the bag. And there's an engine driving each of the propellers, and it drives them through a drive shaft, and it's not a solitary drive shaft. It would be far too long, it would buckle. So the Germans had a shaft, and then a universal joint, another shaft, a universal joint, and a third one, and then a right angle joint to turn the propeller. This was incredible engineering at the time, it really was. 87 of these were built, and Horst is going to talk today about this, and I don't want to give his talk, but I don't think many survived the war. Most of them were destroyed. The problem being helium, of course. Well, at any rate, any other questions or anything anybody has? Yeah, Bob.
You said most of these planes were for observation.
Yeah.
What kind of range and speed did they have?
Well, most of the aircraft of World War I, let me back up. At the start of the war, the average speed of the aircraft was around 50 to 60 miles an hour, no more. By the end of the war, there was one American airplane, and that was the only fighter plane developed by the United States during World War I. It was a Packard Lassac 11. It had an airspeed of 150 miles an hour. So in the period of 1 year, 4 years of the war, there was that advance. Now the American plane was kind of a sad story, really. They only built 28 of them, and none of them ever saw combat. They were all powered by the Liberty 425 horsepower inline liquid-cooled engine, which was the best aircraft engine of the war, clearly. But it never got in the air, and it was not designed by an American. Lassac was a Frenchman who came over to this country on an air mission and designed the airplane built by Packard. In the middle of the war, most of the fighter planes had an airspeed of around 110 miles an hour. That was about average. Some of them a little bit more than that. And in World War II, and even today, aircraft are measured by their range. How far can they fly? In World War I, it was endurance. How long can they stay in the air, which is kind of the same thing. The average endurance of a fighter plane is about 2 hours, maybe a little less. Some of the reconnaissance planes had a duration up to 6 hours, and that was quite a long time. And there's a couple of British planes that were. It took a very brave man to be a pilot in World War I. In fact, there were more deaths from aviators due to accidents, and flying accidents and aircraft failure, where in a steep dive or turn the fabric of the control surface would shred off, or where an entire wing would fall off. And there were more people killed in accidents in operation than there were shot down in combat. And the interesting thing is, all they had parachutes, and the men using the tethered gas balloons that went up used them to jump out when their hydrogen-filled balloon was shot down by an aircraft. The pilots didn't use parachutes. They were available, but they were not used. And it's difficult to know why they were not used. I mean, I find it very strange that.
I can tell you why.
Why?
Because speaking of the British forces, the High Command decided that if the pilots had parachutes, they might be tempted to use them to radiate combat.
Well, I guess their theory was that it's easier to replace a pilot than an airplane, which is a little odd. Yeah.
What was the answer he gave?
Yeah.
What was the answer he gave?
He said that the British High Command, the British Air Ministry, felt that if they gave parachutes to the British flyers, that the pilots would be tempted to bail out quickly and lose the aircraft. A bit bizarre.
They also said that they thought the pilot was like the commander of a naval ship, and the captain should go down with the ship.
Captain should go down with the ship, yeah. Well, in any event, that was true, and it took a very brave man to be an aviator. One of the problems they had with the aerodromes from which they operated were farmers' fields, primarily, with ruts and potholes and vegetation. And a number of these aircraft models, you'll notice, they had struts that struck out in front of the wheels, or an actual wheel in front to prevent nose-over, because nose-over was a very common event. There's one here, the SPAD SA, that was designed by the French, and it was the first attempt to put a gondola in the front of an airplane with a machine gun in it. And so you have a gondola in front of the propeller, and the rotary engine was behind the front gunner, and the pilot was behind the engine. Well, this was a death trap, because when that airplane nosed over, the gunner was crushed by the engine. And so the French didn't like that very much, particularly because the gunners didn't like that very much. So the French said, well, we'll just give these to the Russians. And they did, and the model I made of that particular aircraft is a Russian version, because only the Russians flew that airplane. When I built the collection, I didn't build the models as if they were factory fresh. That is, I didn't want them to look like they just rolled off of the factory floor. Because the airplanes in World War I didn't have hangars very often. They sat in the open, and they very quickly succumbed to the ravages of the climate. Rain and dust and dirt and grime and oil. And the maintenance of the aircraft was directed entirely to the important things: the engine, the armaments, control surfaces, and all. They paid no attention to the fabric. They soon became stained, and it was particularly obvious on planes that were pontoons or flying boats where they were in salt water. So what I did was I weathered them. I wanted them to look like they really would have looked in World War I. Any other questions or anything? Yeah.
Simple. Where do you get these? Are these very special materials? Where do you get these kind of materials to build?
Well, styrene plastic is available. I've been in model railroading for many, many years, and back about 50 years ago almost, I started using styrene. Styrene is polystyrene. It's a plastic. It's white. It comes in different thicknesses. I use 20 thousandths of an inch thick, 40 thousandths, and 60 thousandths, and those sheets I get in 4 by 8 foot sheets, huge sheets. I use the thinner, like 5 thousandths, which is about the thickness of a piece of paper. 5 thousandths, 10 thousandths, and 15 thousandths in smaller amounts. And this is all available commercially. The balsa wood you can get in any hobby shop. And I use acrylic paints primarily. Thank you. Thank you. So the materials are one of the problems you have is in the decal. I use decals for the markings for the insignia, and again, there's practically nothing available in World War I marks, so I had to make them myself, and I made them out of solid sheets of decal material. Well, I guess, yeah.
By any means, it's a prolific collection, especially when you consider that you already did World War II. I'm just wondering about did you operate by a kind of a schedule, or talk about the logistics of getting such a large
No,
thing done?
I don't. All my life, I haven't been much of a sleeper. About 4 or 5 hours at the most that I ever sleep at night. So it gives you a lot more time to do things, you know. You don't have anybody bothering you. Your wife's not asking you to clean out the garage or anything at that time of night. So no, I didn't have a schedule. I'd just pick an airplane and build it. I gave each one, as I finished it, a number in the collection, and started with number 1 and ended with number 152, and then Sandy and I finished with number 153. And on each of the aircraft, when I'd build it, I'd start with a study of the aircraft and write the critique on it. And the critique, I think, is in the computer here in the middle, and it lists the country for which the aircraft flew and the country which built the aircraft, and they weren't always the same. The Italians often built aircraft for Russia, and the British would fly French aircraft and vice versa. Then I'd have the squadron and the location where it flew, where it operated, and the month and the year. And most of the time I had that information from the data and the various resource books I had. Sometimes I didn't. When I didn't, I'd say unknown squadron and unknown date, or 1918 or something. Then I'd write the history of the aircraft, its success, its failure, who designed it, was it Ernst Heinkel or was it whomever, and then its fate, what happened to it at the end, and then the specifications, the length, the wingspan, its weight, its endurance of hours in the air, and then its armament and crew. That's all in each of the aircraft. And then after I wrote that, then I'd build the airplane.